Has everybody got a seat? I think we're moving to standing room only, which is fantastic. So, good afternoon, and I would like to welcome you all to the first of this term's Sussex Development Lectures, which, as you're probably aware or may not be aware, is the flagship series of development talks lectures that is co-hosted by IDS, by the School of Global Studies at the University, by SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit, and the Centre for International Education. So it's a collaborative exercise, and we host the lectures sometimes in university lecture halls and sometimes here at IDS. And we always have a fantastic range of speakers that get some really good debates going, and I think this term is going to be no exception to that. We've called the series Debunking Development Myths. You can take from that what you like, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of debunking that happens during the next few weeks. And to kick this series off, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Duncan Green. Now, Duncan's work may well be known to many of you. I hope it is. Duncan is a senior strategic advisor at Oxfam UK. He's also a professor of practice at the LSE in London. And he's also a long-standing visiting fellow at IDS, and we've had a lot of engagements with him over the years. A few years ago, he wrote a book that's become very famous called From Poverty to Power. And he's also written extensively on social change, political change in Latin America, and also runs a fantastic blog, which, for those of you who don't know it, I would strongly advise reading and getting on the list for, as a really incisive set of critical, quite cheeky, myth-busting analyses of development issues and moments. But today is a very special lecture because Duncan's going to be talking about his brand new book, How Change Happens, which has just been published and is going to be available after the lecture downstairs in the upper common room. I'll wave it around. There's its picture there, fantastic cover, ripped open pages. There we go, there's some myth busting for you. And after the lecture, you're all going to be invited downstairs where we'll have some drinks, some celebration of the book, and Duncan will be available to sign copies if you would like to purchase them. I'm sure they're available at a good price. But anyway, over to Duncan now, who's going to talk for about 40 minutes about the book and about some of its themes, and then we'll have the opportunity for debate and discussion. Thanks very much.
I have to stand over here so I can wield the PowerPoint. So it's brilliant to be at IDS. IDS is kind of my spiritual home. I don't always understand what people say here, but I always agree with it. It's so complicated. I've got this fantastic job at Oxfam, which is I'm allowed to read and encouraged to read, not least to save all my colleagues from reading, because I then summarise what I read into nice blog-sized pieces for them. And for the last few years, I've been standing back and thinking about this question of how change happens, because there isn't a department of change studies that would-be activists, change agents, all sorts of terrible words, can go to have an explanation. And so we each have a different way of thinking about change. And I've been sort of surveying and talking to people and trying to sort of pull it together a bit. So I'm going to present the more interesting bits of the book. The good news about the book is it's much shorter than the last book. Okay? So From Poverty to Power, its main use, as far as I can work out, has been to prop up computer screens in Oxfam offices around the world, because it was like a doorstop. This one's much shorter, so if nothing else, it's an improvement in that sense. Okay, this change is not a new topic. Okay, 6th century BC, Heraclitus, everything changes and nothing stands still. Marx. I worry about this Marx quote because I think people are taking it too much to heart. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Certainly in Oxfam, they've gone completely to the other extreme. So the point is, activists only change the world, they never try to interpret it. And I'm worried that we've gone too far, and in the sense the book is standing back and saying, okay, yes, we're activists, yes, we want to be active. We also need to be reflectivists. We need to think about what's happened in history, what's happening out there, what the literature says, and then move between the two, and then we'll be better activists, among other things. So it's trying to make the case for a bit more reflection amongst the NGOs and the aid and development activists. The audience, there's some terrible jargon in the aid and development business. I think IDS is responsible for quite a lot of it. But what do you call people who are trying to change things? I don't know, let's call them change agents. What a terrible phrase. But it is the audience for the book, because it's not just protesters, it's not just people in the street. Actually, if you work with people in government, people in the private sector, a lot of them are trying to bring about change, and the processes they adopt and the ways they think about change are remarkably similar. So I think that's why I've deliberately gone for the full James Bond sort of change agent audience, because I think a lot of this stuff speaks beyond the usual suspects in terms of working with people who are trying to bring about change. I'll get to the end of the pitch about the book soon and start saying something interesting, don't worry. But the book covers, the most interesting bit for me was, in terms of making me think harder and in a different way about stuff, was the first section, which was where I tried to understand what on earth people meant when they were talking about systems thinking. For years I just thought it was, hot air, and I've now I've drunk the Kool-Aid, I've joined the clan. I now talk about systems thinking the whole time, and people probably just think I'm talking hot air, but it's really important. Power, I'd already sort of, it's in the title of the previous book. I think putting together power and systems gets you into some really interesting conversations. And then the missing piece, I think, in a lot of what activists do and think about is norms. What do we think is natural, normal? What is the human condition? And how quickly that is changing. Look at things like equal marriage, violence against women, child rights, disability. There is an endless number of norm changes going on around us, and I think that's probably one of the biggest impacts of activist movements has been to accelerate the shift in norms in very positive ways. Not always positive ways, but often positive ways. So that's the first section, is that sort of overall framework for thinking about the book. Then we trod through the institutions, trying to get my colleagues in the NGO system to think seriously about states, to realise that states are themselves systems, that they're not all one thing, that there's different actors within states at different levels of geography, at different functions, and that you can find allies in the states, and states change over time. And just to get the sense of the state as an evolving system, which is not a monolith, and therefore can be worked with and on, is kind of one of the purposes of the book. A bit about the international system, a bit about transnational corporations, just to kind of flesh that out. Then on to the bit which is more about us, change actors, change agents, civil activism. A lot of sort of focus of Oxfam was on active citizenship. So trying to understand actually how that happens. It's kind of not generally just a bunch of CSOs having meetings. Amazingly, there's a lot more to it than that. So trying to work out what civic activism actually looks and feels like. Leadership. People have very conflicting emotions about leadership, because certainly if you come from a sort of vaguely Marxist background, vaguely structuralist background, you're much happier with masses than with leaders. Leaders are going to betray you, leaders have got their own interests. Let's stick with the kind of amorphous blob of social masses who are doing good stuff. Look at a social mass of any kind and you will find leaders at all levels. So trying to understand how leaders lead, how they work, how different levels of leadership link up with each other, and what motivates people. I spent some time with some fascinating leaders in different parts of the world for the book. That's kind of a missing piece, I think, for many people on the left of the sort of this group of aid and development community. And then advocacy, which is my sort of home turf, which is basically shouting at governments, trying to get them to do stuff. I think we've got a bit better at it, but there's still a lot of that goes on. And then the classic development book sets out a brilliant sort of analysis of the problem and then says, nah, political will, or something rubbish, some terrible set of complete absent so whats. So I spent a lot of time working with people trying to get a decent set of so whats. So what I'll do now, because I haven't got a year to rant at you, is to talk about the first and the last bits, and you just have to believe me or buy the book that there's a lot of stuff in the middle which kind of makes sense of it all. The cake. Welcome to the cake. To make a cake, you need ingredients, you need a recipe, you need an oven. Wherever you are, whoever you are, whenever you are in history, if you have those three things and you follow the recipe, you will produce something cake-like, which can be eaten. The project. This is the mental model around which aid circulates. It is almost impossible to imagine aid without projects. Okay? Whenever you travel, people come up to you and say, "Can I show you my project?" Projects are a thing. They're an artifact. They grew out of infrastructure after World War II. Building bridges, building roads, you need a project. But now we have to have projects if we're working on child rights, if we're working on women's empowerment, if we're working on anything, you have to shape it into a project. The trouble is that projects, for all their bells and whistles, are essentially cake-like. They are quite linear processes, and we're trying to apply them in situations like this. This is a US military mind map from Afghanistan. Okay, it's a US military PowerPoint. And when it was leaked, everybody laughed at it, and I looked at it and I thought, that's brilliant. That's a really good attempt to do a stakeholder mapping of Afghanistan. The consultant who did it was sacked when it was shown to General Petraeus, because he didn't think this was a very good stakeholder mapping. The point about this is it's a complex system. Okay. Now, a complex system is different from a complicated system. Complicated, if you're really smart and you've got a lot of computers, you can work it out. A complex system has so many connections and feedback loops, so many interactions, that if you poke the system with $100 million of aid or 10,000 US Marines, effects will ripple through this system. And there's a number of features about how those ripples happen. One is, it's unpredictable. It's not about you being smarter than, or getting more smart people in. It is inherently unknowable because there are too many, it's a many-body problem with too many connections. So you can't predict what's going to happen. And second, if something does happen, you can't be sure why. You can't attribute it to your action because there are too many connections. So if you're in systems like this, where you can't predict what's going to happen, and if something happens, you can't be sure why, what are you doing with your cake? Because your cake is saying, we can predict, and when something happens, we can do our monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and we can say, yeah, that was us, give us some more money. So there's a fundamental dissonance between the model we're using in aid and development and the systems we're using it in. So what people do is they look for little linear bits, right? So they say, well, okay, Afghanistan's really complicated, but let's just do vaccines, okay? Because that's kind of linear. Or you lie, okay? So Ros Ivan from IDS has spent an entire career explaining how people in aid lie. And it's beautiful, it's brilliant the way she does it. She says, basically, if you're working in an office of an aid agency, you're not stupid. You can see that the world's like this, and you surf it and ride it, and you improvise and you make it up as you go along. And then it comes time to report to HQ, and you sanitize it all into your cake. You you fit it all into the log frame, you keep your bosses happy, and you spend the entire time riding these two horses, which is very dangerous, generally, and very exhausting. But that is an essential part of the aid business as long as we have these two incompatible models in our heads. So there's certain features about systems and how change happens in systems which I think challenge us. By us, I mean people like Oxfam, people working on aid and development. The first is change is not generally smooth. It isn't, spread of mobile phones or something like that. There are some smooth, steady changes, but a lot of change is spiking. There are these moments. There is the Arab Spring. There is the Syria crisis. These things, which political scientists call critical junctures, are massively important for how change happens, because they act as kind of attractors, centers for change processes. So in those moments, political relations are thrown into the air, power relations are thrown into the air, new things become possible. In Britain, women got the vote after World War I. We got the national health system after World War II. These are not accidents. This is when new possibilities emerge, political, economic, social. And the interesting thing about critical junctures is they're like fractals, they're like sort of Russian dolls in that they happen on the big scale, like world wars, but actually when you go and talk to communities about their own change processes, you find exactly the same thing, that there are these moments, these crises, there's often a conflict when someone gets hurt, when suddenly people think, I'm going to stop this happening, I'm going to I'm going to get up and do something, and they change the nature of the community. Path dependence. So one thing leads to another, and it's very, every context is different. That's the kind of mantra for people here, and a lot of academics working on development. If every context is different, then what are we doing with all these toolkits, all these best practice processes, which aid actors insist on a lot of the time? So there's a real question there, I think, about if places are path dependent, at the very least, you should be starting with your best practice, and accept it's only hopeful practice, and then adapting it to the local situation. So there's real questions there about comparability between countries. I was at a meeting with Save the Children this morning where they were saying, we tried to collect global indicators on maternal and child health, and it was completely pointless. And I was going, no, really? Wow. And that's because every context is different, and these attempts to make everything fit into a single number is often mistaken. Uncertain causation I talked about. So this is all a big problem. And my colleagues in Oxfam don't like me using words like complexity or systems. So I had to boil it down a bit. And I suppose that the essence of this is how do you plan when you don't know what's going to happen? And how do you advocate, campaign, be an activist when you don't know what the answer is? And I think those two questions are pretty important in terms of reshaping and rethinking the way we do our work. But Mike Tyson put it much more clearly. So I always have slightly mixed feelings about putting Mike Tyson up there, because he's not a nice man, but this is a brilliant quote. So it is, you go into the aid business or the project or whatever with your plan, and then reality punches you in the mouth. And the question then is, what do you do? Okay? Some people just carry on and are repeatedly punched in the mouth and just think this is what the job is. Some people change what they're doing and respond and have feedback and are adaptive, and I'm with the second group, because I believe they might be punched in the mouth very much. Power. All my cultural references are about 10 years old, because that's when my kids made me watch lots of good films. Okay, so apologies, you probably don't even know who this is, but there's a moment in the first Matrix film, right, where Neo, who's a not terribly hidden version of Jesus, but much better dressed, sees the matrix, okay, and he can see the ones and zeros which make up the matrix, which is all reality, and at that point he becomes invincible. And there was a moment, without the invincibility bit, there was a moment when I started to get the power was a bit like this, because once you start thinking about power in the way they've developed at IDS with the power cube, the way Joe Rowlands has done with power within and power with and power to, once you start really thinking about power, it's very hard to think about anything else. Robert Chambers has done this fantastic, this heuristic which I use all the time, which is in this relationship, am I an upper or a lower? Because that really is all there is. Once you decide and once you realise you're an upper in a relationship, you behave in a certain way. Once you realise you're a lower in a relationship, you behave in a different way. So thinking about power seems to be the essence of all of this stuff. This is the only quote from Foucault I've ever understood. So I always put it on a slide to demonstrate that I belong somewhere like the IDS. But it's a really wonderful quote. Have a read. So this is a kind of power where it's invisible, it's internalized, people interiorize their own oppression. There's a version from Guatemala, very similar, but from a Mayan activist, about what this process feels like. It's basically making you think you are stupid, and you've been told you're stupid all your life, and then something happens, and you do what these women are doing in front of these police, and you get a sense of power within, and entitlement, and rage, and everything starts to change. And then once you've got that sense of power within, you look around you, and you find power with people in similar situations, and then it all kicks off. So thinking about power gets you into much more interesting places, I think. Joe Rowland's colleague at Oxfam, who's also got, I think, ties to IDS, had come up with this very handy model. The trouble for me with hidden and invisible power is it makes you feel a bit helpless. It does make you feel like, oh, you know, they're just all out to get us, and we're doomed. Joe's stuff was about the light bulb moment, the power within, and then what happens next, the power with, and the power to do things. And I like that. It's a book called, it's a book about women's empowerment in Honduras, and it's been very influential in shaping people's work, similar to some work by Stephen Luke's. So I think, yeah, this is a really useful way to to flip the power conversation to making you feel that something can be done. And we use it. We use power analysis. It's not the greatest phrase, but here's an example from Tajikistan. So I was in Tajikistan with our country team. We were looking at water and sanitation. And I don't know if anybody from Tajikistan here? Before I make a fool of myself? Excellent. Nothing worse than banging on out of country and someone says, that's not true, I live there, I'm from there, you know, that stuff. So post-Soviet country, the poorest, I think, one of the poorest of the post-Soviet countries, and it's a total mess because after years and years of massive state dependence, the state kind of disappeared, and there's just a vacuum there, and it's very difficult in public services. So water and sanitation, we were trying to get people involved at a community level in actually monitoring and paying for water. In IDS terms, this is quite a right-wing bit of programme, because we're actually trying to get people to pay for water so they feel ownership of the water supply and the water issue. The initial power analysis by our staff was, well, there's citizens and then there's the authorities, and that's all there is. And I said, I bet that's not true. Who else? Talk to me about the village. And people started just chatting about what went on in this particular village we'd been to. And they said, well, you know, the doctor's very influential, and so is the teacher. And the truck driver drives from place to place and brings in lots of new ideas and is quite actually respected as a kind of thought leader, we would say, in the village. And if you have bad dreams, you go to the imam. Very important for the interpretation of what's going on in your soul and your head. And they started populating this village, you know, with lots and lots of stakeholders. You know, they were actually doing a proper power analysis. And then we said, okay, so let's look at how much they agree with us on the water and sanitation issue, and then how influential they are. And what we want is everybody to be up here, so they're really influential and they agree with us. And if they're not there, if they're influential and they don't agree with us, then we do advocacy to try and move them up there. And if they agree with us but they're very powerless, then we help them organise, get a voice. So the power analysis actually shapes what you do. You think, how can we get people up to the top right-hand side? And we do that on international processes like the Arms Trade Treaty, right down to a village water committee in Tajikistan. It's a useful way of thinking about stuff. None of this is the only way to do things. They're just interesting angles on a complex system. So I wrote this book, and I showed it to my son, who's a community organiser, and to his credit, he read it, because he reads books, but then he said, but this is actually not going to help, because I need you to boil this down to 2 slides so that I can remember it in the next meeting. Otherwise, it's just going to be one of those books I've read. And I said, Callum, I've just written an entire book about how we shouldn't have toolkits, and we shouldn't have everything reduced to a best practice. And he said, well, it's your choice. Either it'll have no impact, or you do 2 pages. So I kind of said, okay. So I boiled it down as much as I could without destroying the argument of the book. And it came up with something that I call the power and systems approach. Okay? Carefully chosen. My favourite cartoon, equation, 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 then a miracle occurs. And one guy saying, I think we should be more explicit here in step 2. Right? And this is a surprisingly accurate picture of a lot of monitoring and evaluation conversations in the aid sector. So I went to one in East Africa where they'd spent phenomenal amounts of money, where their model of change, this was 12 Ways, an excellent NGO, their model of change was get information to poor communities about how crap the education system is, and they will take action to sort out education. Right? So, get information to poor people, they will take action. And some clever academics came in and pointed out that there were 17 different assumptions. You know, A, poor people don't already know that the education system is crap. They think that if they do something about it, it will have impact. They don't think they're going to be beaten up if they do anything. Yeah, they just unpacked it, and we all went, oh wow, there's a lot behind the arrow. Whenever you see arrows in theories of change, just ask what's in the arrow, what's behind the arrow, because there's usually a lot like that. Anyway, I digress. So the two bits of this approach is who are we? How do we think and how do we work? And then a more sort of standard set of questions I think we should be asking. And it doesn't say what the answers to the questions are, and it doesn't say what you should do, because that's too toolkitty. This is like, upstream from the toolkit. How do we think? I don't think there's enough curiosity certainly amongst the NGOs. When I moved there from DFID, I was really struck. In DFID, there's lots of underemployed PhDs. They like going to seminars. They have very, very sort of arcane and interesting conversations. You get to Oxfam, and people, they basically want to know enough to do their job. And as soon as they think they know enough, that's it. Thank you, it's all shut now. I'm just going to be active. And I don't think that works in systems, because in systems, it's unpredictable, it keeps changing. You've got to want to know about the system. You've got to want to dance with the system. Fantastic words from Donella Meadows' book, Thinking in Systems. And people have to like dancing with the system. Classically in the NGOs, this is the conversation you have in the bar after you spend your day doing log frames. You go to the bar and then you talk about the gossip. You talk about the politics, who's in, who's out, who's interesting. That's the bit that you should be doing instead of the log frame. That's understanding the system better. Humility. So, humble bragging. Are people familiar with the phrase humble bragging? There are some extraordinary. I think Twitter's responsible, but humble bragging has become a thing where people like that Yanis bloke, the economist, say, humbled that so many people came to listen to me tonight. That's not the kind of humility I'm talking about, right? This is genuine evidence-based humility that if you don't know what's going to happen, say so and act on that understanding. So actually be aware that you don't understand and that you don't know. And then the really difficult thing, especially for activists, is being comfortable with there might be 2 answers to this question, there might be 10 answers to this question, being comfortable with ambiguity and just thinking that's actually really interesting. I don't need to be scared of that. I don't need to sort of try and decide which one's right. I just live with them and sort of see what happens. Working with ambiguity, I think, is very difficult for activists, but I think it's an essential part of being honest about systems. Reflexivity, hats off to John Gaventa, to Robert James, to all the people at IDS who've worked on this. There was some fantastic research in West Africa where they have black researchers doing interviews with local people, and they got a certain set of answers to these research questions. And then the actual experiment was that in half of them, they had a white researcher sitting in the corner not saying anything. And they got completely different answers to the questions. Right? And that was the actual bit of, that was what research was actually about. Fascinating exercise in the power that was in the room during this interaction. So when we're interviewing people, think about uppers and lowers, think about be reflexive, think about your own power in this situation. Multiple perspectives. So there's a thing which I call the flip chart problem in Oxfam. When we're talking about who we should be working with and having one of our end of strategy meetings, I usually pipe up and say, well, what about faith organisations? Because if you actually ask poor people in almost any country who they trust, which institutions they actually relate to, it's not going to be NGOs or political parties or universities. It's going to be faith institutions. And people go, yeah, absolutely right. And then at the end of the hour, or 2 hours, you look at the flip charts, and weirdly, that never made it to the flip chart. There's a kind of institutional spitting out of unusual allies, people we're uncomfortable working with. And they don't get into the system. And that's why we end up working with lots of CSOs who look just like us. Middle class, they might be from different countries, but they're basically middle class, shared assumptions, and that's such a narrow part of the system that you then decided you're going to work with. So we just about work with the private sector, as long as they're sort of big and transnational and not too right-wing. We don't like faith organisations. Traditional leaders, give me a break, I'm not going to work with them. So, there's a real question about who we are, how we're artificially narrowing down potential, because in general, this is a massive claim, but I think if you're working in an alliance on a narrow issue with a wide range of different and slightly awkward allies, you're more likely to get an interesting result than if you're working on a very vague thing with a very narrow group of allies. Exhibit A for a very vague thing with a narrow group of allies would be the Sustainable Development Goals. Right? Exhibit B for a narrowly focused with a broad range of things would be something like the Ethical Trading Initiative, where supermarkets, garment companies, trade unions and NGOs are doing really interesting things on labour in supply chains. So I'm much happier in that second group, because I think these big NGO only or civil society only things are largely hot air. The questions we ask, I've talked about this. Yes, we talk about policy. I think we talk too much about policy. Practice, trying to link up practice and policy. Again, this meeting at Save the Children this morning, I was getting really worried that people talking about advocacy have become a separate guild. They're a profession with their own language and their own methods, and that makes it impossible for them to actually talk to non-advocates. But the whole message of this is they've got to team up with people working on the ground, people in different sectors. So the professionalisation of advocacy is becoming a big problem for us. And then norms bringing on precedents. So for 2 years now, I've been ranting on about a particular research exercise on inequality. So we're all talking about inequality. Oxfam rocks up to Davos meeting every year and does its 62 people have the same wealth as 3.5 billion poorest people, sound bites, and gets fantastic press coverage and all the rest of it. And we'd say, we must tackle inequality, right? And then say, okay, that's interesting. There are 23 countries over the last 50 years that have actually reduced inequality for a period of 8 years or more. We just went and spent a day looking at the database. No one has bothered to look at them. No one has done a comparative study of those 23 countries about the politics that led to these periods of redistribution. Malaysia, 1969 to 1991, those sort of periods. The policies they followed when they did it, and the politics which ended those periods of redistribution, because we're not interested in history. So one set of precedents we really need to think much more about is historical precedent for what we're saying. I'm a friend and a massive fan of Ha-Jing Chang, because I think he's done this brilliantly on economic policy. What were the policies that countries actually followed on trade or agriculture or intellectual property when they were developing? Oh look, it's completely opposite to what the WTO or the World Bank is telling developing countries now. So I think it really does add to the conversation to look at history. But the other precedent is that on any issue, not everything is the same. So if you look at something like child malnutrition, there will be a spectrum in a village, and some of the kids will be really malnourished, and some of the kids will not. And some brilliant Save the Children people called Jerry and Monica Sturdin, which I was introduced to by Ben, this story, went to Vietnam. They had a very short timescale to achieve something. So what they did was they went to a village and they said to people, are all the kids equally malnourished? And the people said no, obviously. Okay, identify the ones with the kids that are least malnourished, and then let's just go and watch and see what they're doing differently. And they developed, they identified what people were doing differently, and then they didn't turn it into a toolkit. They just put it up on the notice board, and people said, oh, yeah, okay, we can do that. And then other people started to do it. So identifying the outliers, and then social learning, which meant that people adopted it. They'd done this on FGM in Egypt, female genital mutilation. 97% of women were being cut in Egypt when Monica Sturdin was asked to go and help. And being a positive deviance person, she said, oh, let's look at the 3%. And they went and they interviewed the 3% of women who were not being cut and tried to find out what was different. They said, do you think they'll go on camera? And all the activists said, oh, they'll never go on camera. And the women said, sure, we'll go on camera. And they interviewed them, and they developed a whole campaign based on that 3%. And yet we don't do this because this isn't us. This is out there. It's not an easy thing to turn into a project. It's not easy to fundraise for. And yet the kind of examples in the book, the positive deviance approach, North and South, they've done superbugs in American hospitals like this as well. They always get called in when nothing else works. And I think in terms of thinking about precedents, positive deviance has huge potential. And we're not even, I was talking to John Venture, we're not even thinking, there's no institution in Britain that I know of, certainly not in aid and development, which is saying, let's do positive deviance, let's see where that takes us. the power, the matrix moment. You know, I like to think that power is this force field, because I did physics about 1 million years ago. There's this force field which is power, and you need to learn to see, make it visible, and then think about redistributing it from the uppers to the lowers. That's basically what we do a lot of the time, whether it's an economic, political, social field, it's redistribution of power. Once you start thinking about things like that, I think it sort of makes sense of a lot of the discussions in development. And then going back to a complex system. Let's assume that any clever idea we come up with is not the best one. It may not even be a good one. It may be absolutely awful. How quickly are we going to realise that and change course? If I'm cycling through the streets of Brighton and I decide I'm going to plan my journey on a log frame, which will set out directions and velocity at all times between me and the other side of the city in advance, I will die. Okay, very quickly. What I need is feedback loops to realise that if a car's coming towards me, I change direction. That's how aid and the development business has to be as well. So how good are our feedback loops? And it's interesting because, you know, there's lots of hierarchies in the aid development business, and generally, advocates look down on long-term development, and long-term development look down on humanitarians, and humanitarians usually looking into a well or something. Okay. But on this stuff, actually humanitarians are quite good. They kind of notice when there's a drought or an earthquake, and they have a whole system in place to respond to it. So I think we should stop, you know, get away from that hierarchy and start thinking, well, when do people actually use feedback loops well, and what can we learn? So, you know, we don't have a system in Oxfam equivalent to the humanitarian system of saying this is a category 1 disaster. A category 1 disaster means everybody drops everything if asked and moves to work on that disaster. We don't have the Arab Spring wasn't that for us, and it should have been. So I think we could have learned a lot more in terms of responding to critical junctures if we had these feedback loops in place. Have I got time to?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So, as well as having food grade, you've got to have a 2x2, right? This is another vital part of the aid development business. It helps us think about solutions. And I'm going to do 2 2x2s. This one's really good. It's from Rowan Kelleher, who's doing brilliant work on gender and gender rights over the last few years or something. And it's talking about what kind of change are we involved in here. Is it in the formal sphere of governments, rules, things which are formally expressed? Is it the informal of how people treat each other, what's going on? And then is it at an individual level, or is it systemic? If you're in individual and formal, then you're talking about livelihoods, jobs, wages, there's certain sort of access to water, sanitation, marine resources. If you're down here, if it's formal and systemic, then you're in laws and policies and traditional advocacy work. If it's individual and informal, it's consciousness, capabilities, power within, light bulb moments for people. And then informal and systemic, that's social norm change. Some fantastic work on violence against women from Platoon and Weldon, looking at how is it that policy has changed so fast on violence against women over the last 30 years? Policy. I'm not saying practice has changed, has kept up. And they did a really, the US political scientists said they had to do a massive regression. And what they found was, and we like the answers, so obviously we talk about it all the time, they found that the biggest explanatory variable behind progress on policy on violence against women was the existence of a grassroots feminist movement. Okay. So really interesting that you need the big changes in social norms at the UN, CEDAW, the conventions and so on, and then you need the pressure from below. The Philippine activists talked about it as a rice cake strategy. To make a good rice cake, you need heat from above and heat from below. And that seems to be the best stuff I've read so far on how norms shift so fast. That's one 2x2. And then the other one came up from a USAID and DFID workshop which Ben organised. Okay. Yes, okay. And the reason I like this is because it meant that people who love log frames and planning still have a role. Okay? Because I felt a bit sorry for them after all the cake and stuff. So, on this axis is how well do you think you understand the context? Have you worked in this country for 50 years? Do you have loads of local staff who are senior in the organisation? They know what they're doing? Okay. That's good. Or is it a new one? Is it you just come here, you're a bit, you're not clear, you haven't really mapped out what's going on? And then in terms of the intervention, is this something that's your stock in trade? Have you been doing cash transfers for 20 years and this is a cash transfer program? Or is it something wacky and you're not confident about it? No. So, if you understand the context and you're pretty confident on the intervention, relax. You can do log frames, you can do the traditional linear planning as long as you have regular evaluation to check whether you actually do understand both the intervention and the context. You've got to roll. So that's like, the trouble is the A business thinks everything is in this quadrant. If you understand the context but you're not confident on the intervention, then why not try lots of different things? There are people out there who are really good at doing multiple parallel experiments. They're called venture capitalists. Right? They will fund 10 startups, knowing that 9 of them are going to fail. And then one of them is going to go really big. I've seen one of those in Oxfam, and I've been banging on about it for 6 years, and it has not been replicated, which suggests my own power is very limited in Oxfam. Very interesting approach. Very hard to sell to donors. Hey, we've got a 90% failure rate, but the 10% is really good. But it should be sellable. Multiple parallel experiments is a great way when you know the context but you're not sure on the intervention. Try different things. If you're confident on the intervention but you're not sure you understand the context, you behave differently. If you're doing cash transfers in Somalia and something goes wrong, you don't say, oh, let's stop doing cash transfers and start doing mobile banking or something else. You say, okay, we need fast feedback and we'll move the cash transfers to where the people have run away to, and you respond. So that's the kind of argument for the fast feedback loops. And then the really interesting one is, of course, the situation where you don't know what you're doing and you don't know what's going on. Okay, this bit. Now this quadrant, I think, is probably a lot more people are in this quadrant than would care to admit it. One answer is positive deviance. Okay, so it's not about us. Let's just look. Let's just study what's going on and see where the positive outliers are. Another possibility is, well, okay, let's study this and get us out as an employer LDS to do lots of papers and make sure we understand the context, or massively simplify what we're trying to do and get into a simpler intervention. So I like this because it gives you a way of navigating and adjusting your approach according to where you are and what you're doing. And that's enough, I think, for me.
Fantastic. Well, that's great. That's great. You've given us a huge amount to think about and some great cultural reference into my decade as well, so I'm getting this. So look, before we move into questions, I'm going to suggest something we quite often do with these lectures. Wake everybody up a bit by saying, turn to your neighbour, either side of you, or be a three if you like, and just share, just buzz for a couple of minutes on perhaps something that you found really interesting, something that you found surprising, maybe, in the talk. Just have a quick little reflect, and then we'll open it up
or
to
annoying.
discussion. Or annoying. It's something that you really cross. hand up thing. Fantastic. Well, there's clearly a lot of talk. So this has clearly stirred up some thoughts, feelings, emotions, anger, fury, happiness. I don't know what. And I think Duncan clearly busted a few myths, which is good for the series. So let's now take some questions, comments. Maybe I'll take them in groups. Could be a question, could be a comment. Try and keep them reasonably short, and then we can get through a few. So we'll take a few questions, and then let Duncan come back, and vice versa. And we're also going to make use of the microphone because this is being live streamed, and we want to be able to pick up your questions as well. So if you could sort of put your hand up, and we'll send the mic around. Okay, so we've got one here.
Hi, thank you. So I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about humility and embracing uncertainty. I'm coming from a background working at an international NGO in Copenhagen, and I definitely think we should be doing more of that. But I'm just wondering, what would be your take on where does that start? Like, is that a donor responsibility, or is that an NGO responsibility? You know, insisting on not always being able to measure results, or not always being able to, you know, predict results for projects.
Great. Down at the front here.
I guess it's a related question. In terms of, I really liked your cake analogy and the idea that the kind of project model is not fit for purpose in the complexity that people are dealing with. But I mean, how do you break that when you've got this sort of donor way of working and the kind of impact agenda and all of those sort of pressures on people who are maybe trying to work in a more ambiguous way?
Ben.
Do you think Oxfam can actually work like this?
I think you know the answer to that.
So, do you want to come? Yeah, come back and then. Three's good. Three's
That's why I
good.
keep my head. So, will the donors allow it? Is the question I get asked a lot about this kind of stuff. And my answer is try, because actually, donors are also systems, and within the donors, there are people who are way ahead on this stuff compared to the NGOs. You know, I had dinner with a guy called Samir Doshi from USAID earlier this week, who is a madman. I mean, he's really interesting. He's in the Global Learning Lab, but he just dropped into the conversation that he once lived in a cave for 6 months and did the washing up for the Dalai Lama. Okay, there are interesting people in the bilateral donors. I'm not sure if that's official. I should probably check with him before I say it. Anyway, it's too late now. It's on camera. It's out. So there are interesting people in the donors who are funding, and there's a network called Doing Development Differently, a network called Thinking and Working Politically, which are donor-led. So I think it's really important that NGOs find their friends and ally. But there's also a hierarchy question. The people who get this tend to be the senior people. The people who stop it happening tend to be the junior people, right? The sticky middle. The people who just come into DFID, work 9 to 4, or maybe 9 to 5, they just want to get through the day, you know, there's some downdraft and bad suits and stuff. Those people, right? So we need to work on them, and probably the best way to work on them is to gang up with their bosses to put pressure on them. So I think if we have, and one way is to actually change the systems that they implement. They don't care. So you just need to change. If the system becomes, as part of your report, show me what you changed, show me what you learned, and if you haven't changed anything, you get marked down, they'll implement that just like they'll implement the key performance indicators. Right? So we need to change the systems, and I think that's happening. So my main argument is, don't use donors as an alibi for not trying. Final story. The venture capitalist model I mentioned in Oxfam, Tanzania, DFID came to us and said, no one's doing anything interesting on accountability in Tanzania. Here's $1 million, try something different. And the Oxfam computer said no. Right? The Oxfam computer stopped us for months taking the check because it didn't have KPIs, it didn't have a log frame, it was just, here's $1 million, try something. Right? So don't tell me that the donors are stopping us doing interesting stuff. That was us. Yeah. Sorry, it was a bit ranty. Second question. Oh, can we actually imagine a world without projects? I mean, everything's a project in the sense that it needs funding and people have to be paid and people have to buy sandwiches and stuff. So in that sense, you will always need projects. But I think there's a lot of different ways that we can do stuff. One of the things that Oxfam increasingly is looking at is taking seriously this idea that external actors are catalysts rather than actual drivers of change processes. So another example from Tajikistan, actually. I didn't give any examples in the talk because there wasn't time, so I'll stick those in as and when now. We had a problem on water and sanitation. So we had a water and sanitation program in Tajikistan, which was rubbish. Okay? It was that classic NGO thing of, well, we're promoting sustainable community management of water. And after 2 or 3 years of this, the community was still knocking on the office door saying, your well's broken, could you come and fix it, please? So there was clearly a problem. We commissioned an evaluation which confirmed our suspicion that our work was rubbish. We then, crucially, published the evaluation and had a big meeting about it. All the other donors said, yeah, that's what's happening to us too. The Swiss come in, and again, another example of good donorship, the Swiss come in and say, well, we'll fund you to do something about this. And actually, we'll fund you for 10 years to do something about this. So what we did was, instead of trying again, we set up a talking shop. And the talking shop had 17 government ministries, all of whom had some responsibility for water and sanitation. Private sector, donors, UN, CSOs. It had a charismatic Palestinian water engineer chairing it. So he made everybody laugh, made everybody happy, kept them in the room. The people who came to those initial meetings said they looked us up online, saw that we weren't a Tajik organisation, and therefore assumed we were reasonably independent. So they decided to give it a go. And we started the forum with no idea what was going to happen. It was just, let's talk about this issue and see what emerges. And the Swiss funded it. All right? We had no clear knowledge of what was going to happen. What emerged in the first couple of years was someone said, oh, we had an investment law. We drafted an investment law, but we never approved it. They found this investment law, dusted it off, and passed it. And then the ministries were so embarrassed about the complete lack of coordination between all the government ministries that they set up an interministerial committee. Now, okay, this is not the stuff that gets your pulse racing, but actually it's really important. So the government is starting to think we need to be joined up on this. Then the government said they would match donor investment. They're now trying to get the days for approval of water investments down from 180 to 25, a kind of very World Banking sort of approach, but very useful. All this was unpredictable, all this emerged, and it's because there was wide stakeholders, very clear problem, and it's one of those examples of multi-stakeholder initiatives which really work, and we're seeing an increasing number of these. So I think that's an example of a project which is not a project. Another example of a project which is not a project is in these complex systems, in that Afghan map, the unit of analysis, the thing which moves around those maps, they are people. Right? The people, the person is the unit of analysis in these systems. And there's a really good system for funding people, not projects or organisations, called scholarships. So actually, you end up with some quite old-fashioned stuff coming out of this, as well as some newfangled stuff. And I think scholarships, we don't fund. We don't do, MacArthur Foundation does Genius Grants for $1 million, where they say, we like what you're doing on scientific innovation, have $1 million and tell us what you spend it on. We don't do that, and I'm not sure why not.
So Ben's question,
Ben's question.
I think you kind of answered it a bit, sometimes.
So, the government, we'll get back to the answer, don't worry, I'm not doing an evasion thing. The government's doing a thing called the Civil Society Review, which was supposed to report last October, and has gone horribly silent, so we're all living in fear and trepidation, but we have a strong suspicion that things are not good. As part of that Civil Society Review, the different people came to my boss, Mark Goldman, and said, NGOs, so last century, justify your existence. And so he said, Duncan, justify our existence. So I did a paper on this, which is called Fit for the Future, ? And it's basically drawing on a lot of the systems thinking, and it's saying, how do you take a supertanker whitewater rafting, is the kind of the overall question. Oxfam's a super tanker, $1 billion program spent per year across the whole of Oxfam International, far too many staff. How do you turn that into a nimble, agile, funky, flexible, adaptive, fast feedbacky sort of organisation? And the answer is with enormous difficulty. But there are some ways to do it. So, setting up little sort of semi-autonomous groups of people, decentralising just like governments do. So we're giving much more power to national officers. The following perhaps the process DFID's done, which is to reduce the number of sign-off processes in the thing they call the smart rules, to just stop. It's called it, in Oxfam we call it the treacle. The treacle is the amount of internal bureaucracy which is so great that people actually don't know whether they're allowed to do something, so they just don't try it. So no one ever tells you not to do something, we just go and don't try it. So how do you get past the treacle? How do you reduce the number of sign-off processes? How do you set people free, especially at national level, and reduce the power of the centre? All of those things are sort of happening, but when something doesn't happen, a useful rule of thumb I find is to say, is this about interests? Is someone getting rich from this? I don't think anybody's getting rich from Oxfam being a bit crap on some of this stuff, right? Is it about ideas? Is it that actually we haven't got these ideas, we're fixed in a certain way of thinking, partly, or is it about institutions? Is it the Oxfam computer says no? And I think a lot of this is about institutional barriers, which can be overcome, but they're really difficult. Fundraising is one part of it. Saying we have to demonstrate results because we've got our mental map of what constitutes evidence has been imported from traditional economics and medicine rather than from other fields, which have perfectly good. I was saying this morning to somebody, if a historian is asked to explain why World War I happens, they don't go, they must do an RCT. They don't go off and set up an experiment, because you can't. They have other ways of looking at evidence, which is very strong and very plausible. We need to look at those other ways of proving it. As long as we're constantly thinking about medicine and those very crude quantitative forms of evidence, we're going to be struggling with some of this stuff. So mixed message on Oxfam.
Great. Well, let's have another round of questions or thoughts. So somebody here.
You briefly mentioned the SDGs and then said that it wasn't really the area of involvement. I worked for an NGO for the past years that was trying very hard to get our specific niche issue onto the SDG agenda, like every other NGO was trying to do. So I just wanted, I'd like to...
Did you manage?
Yes, well, sort of.
Like if you failed to get your issue on the NCA, you were really rubbish. Everybody got their issue.
No, so I just wanted to, I'm interested you to comment a little bit on the value of this kind of big global agenda setting, and also sort of linked to that, how, when we're focusing on making change, like how far do you then, how do you strike the balance between just sort of trying to change things within the agenda as it's moving along that we're already kind of establishing? Like, how do we stop just talking to each other? As it's so I'm talking about the SDGs in that context, like that was the thing that all NGOs had to talk about for the past year, so that's what we all focused on, and that was easy to write to donors and say, we tick these boxes. So how do you strike that balance?
Can we go to James at the back?
Hi, thanks, Duncan. I've got a quick question. We're quite hard on the advocates and the campaigners in a way. So I'm just wondering, if we all own up how complex everything is, where does that leave campaigners who are trying to mobilise wider public opinion and trying to mobilise social movements if they have to say, we don't know the answer and we don't know what it is that you're fighting for, because it's all very complex?
Good question. The lady in the middle here.
Thank you. What processes or systems would you suggest an organisation is to put in place in order to make the most of critical junctures?
These are great questions.
Right, well, have a go at those three.
Cool. Okay. So I have a series of nested rants on the SDGs. I'm just trying to decide whether to use the 30-second one or the sort of 1 hour one or something. So the SDGs were a very silly process. So they started off with a complete absence of curiosity. So the SDGs were, oh my God, what happens after the MDGs run out? Millennium Development Goals. And lots of UN people going, oh my God, we'll be out of job. Quick, think of something. No one ever actually said, maybe we should see if the MDGs achieved anything. No one ever asked, right? And there was a really interesting, there've been a couple of bits of research that have come out very quietly. UNDP took a suspiciously long time to publish the paper, which basically suggested that the MDGs didn't actually influence national governments very much. They influenced a lot of aid talk, but in terms of what governments actually did, not that much. So, first one, absence of interest, absence of curiosity in whether these things work. Enormous obsession with metrics, right? So this is basically about data, right? And that's probably will be the lasting benefit of all this stuff. And then the Christmas trip. So one of the, and I came out very early on and I said, look, I think the SDGs are an awful process, and I spent a lot of time trying to minimise the amount of time Oxfam wasted on them, with some success. I managed to stop people doing things sometimes. But then for some reason they asked me to moderate a consultation on the SDGs of British civil society. There were 250 CSOs in a room. Right? And the high-level panel on the Sustainable Development Goals on the platform. And they had 65 minutes. So my initial spiel was, okay, you have 15 seconds each, right? Every second over 15 seconds, you're taking away from a comrade, because you're all CSOs and we're all in this together. And then all hell broke loose. And the 85 people spoke and demanded 85 different issues should be in the SDGs. And they pretty much all got it, actually, if you look at where the SDGs ended up. And no one ever asked, will this affect how national governments behave? So, now people are starting to think about it. There's lots, there is some research on when do these voluntary international agreements influence national behaviour. And it's about reporting, and it's about league tables, it's about, why would China listen to anything that people say about the SDGs, how is it internalised, all these sort of questions. It was never asked. So it was a very depressing episode. That's the shorter round. If you don't go to activists and say, oh, it's really complicated, we don't really have a clue, then people just go, next campaign, please. That is, you're in a market, and that's not a great product. On the other hand, there are let's take a really stupid campaign. Okay, probably the most stupid campaign of recent times. Make poverty history. Right? Now there's a campaign which is daft. It says, a bunch of white activists can make poverty history by sorting out trade, aid, and debt. Okay, just think about that for a moment, and you realise it's a completely stupid proposition. And yet it's seen as a great campaign because it got numbers, it sold 3 million white armbands, all this sort of stuff. That sort of campaign I don't think we should be doing. But there's other kinds of campaigns. There are movements which are much more dispersed and much more, equal marriage, women's rights. We could be part of those. We could identify things which are genuine global collective action problems, like tax evasion or climate change or migration, and focus on those. There are things which you can do globally which require an old-fashioned global campaign. But making poverty history is not one of them. It's a longer question. I'm not sure I have the answers, because I sort of want to educate people, and that's probably fatal if you're trying to organise a campaign. But they need to be able to grasp that things are unpredictable and that stuff happens. A colleague of mine says, whenever there's an aid scandal, people say cut the aid budget. Whenever there's a scandal in an NHS hospital, people don't say stop the NHS. They say sort out the hospital. And we need to get the depth of commitment to these sort of questions which lead to that sort of answer rather than the cut aid answer. What was the question on critical junctures? How do we work around them? Okay, so I'm still on camera, right? Okay. There was a really interesting example of Oxfam being not quite as good as it could be on critical junctures. So 3 months into the Arab Spring, 2011, Syria hadn't blown up yet. Everybody was, it looked really exciting, once in a generation moment of change. Sort of autocracies falling all across North Africa. Wow, right? 3 months into this, I go to a meeting of the big cheeses in Oxfam, the CEOs of the 17 Oxfam affiliates. And there's an item on the Arab Spring on the agenda, and the conversation is exclusively about, do we need to plan for a refugee crisis? Okay, is there going to be a surge of refugees which we'll have to respond to? And then they start chatting, and I chip in and other people chip in. At some point there's a kind of gestalt shift in the room, and people go, oh, this is actually a good thing, isn't it? There's all these autocracies falling, there's new constitutions, shit, we better do some advocacy. And they rapidly responded, and they put some money into lobbying at the Arab League. I think we probably wheeled out some lawyers to help with constitutions, all that kind of stuff. But it took 3 months because we didn't have feedback loops in place on this like we do on humanitarian. So one is feedback loops and the ability to respond, right? So you have feedback loops on famine, early warning systems, but you don't have the system to respond because governments only start signing checks when the pictures appear on the telly. So you need the feedback loops and you need the response capability. That's one. I think decentralization helps because you notice these things on the ground. So another story about where Oxfam is not quite as good as it could have been. In 2008, 30 years of falling food prices suddenly goes into this extraordinary spasm, and food prices went all over the place. Riots broke out in 30 countries. People saying the food system is broken, blah, blah, blah. All our teams in country, just because they were shopping, just because they were feeding their families, knew that something was going on. The first we knew about it in Oxfam Central was when the press phoned up and asked for a comment. Because we didn't have a decentralised system of feedback, which meant that what was going on the ground came up to head office and made us think. No one was putting together the stories from different countries. So a lot of it is about the systems. I think that helps. But then the other thing is actually allowing agility. So final story, a good Oxfam story, sort of. Another thing happened in 2008, there was this kind of financial crisis. And it was a classic critical juncture in advocacy for the Tobin tax. So in the 1970s, this nerdy economist, Nobel-winning person called James Tobin, suggested a small tax on financial transactions. Every time you move between one currency and another, a tiny, tiny tax. He said it would raise lots of money for good causes, and it would damp down currency speculation. I don't think he was right on the second one, but he would certainly raise a lot of money. No one took any notice. I remember, campaigning on this in the 90s, going to see Ed Balls, and he was going, what's this? Take it away. 2008, and suddenly bankers are pariahs, the financial markets are evil, and governments are desperate for new sources of revenue. So a bunch of very, very smart campaigners, including a colleague Max Lawson at Oxfam, get together and say, Tobin tax, this is the moment, isn't it? This is the critical juncture for the Tobin tax. But it's no good calling it a Tobin tax or a financial transactions tax. Let's call it the Robin Hood tax. So they, brilliant campaigners, rebrand it, boom, goes massive. Now what happens then is you get in Bill Nye and Richard Curtis and all these lobbyists who make fantastically funny videos. It goes to scale, you get a big campaign going, and the governments react. Now the British government, it will be the last to ever agree one of these things because it's a tax on financial transactions, which is the city, right? But 10 countries in Europe are now negotiating the introduction of a Europe-wide FTT. It's taking a long time, these things do, but it's happening. Now, there are a few things more historically significant than a new tax. They start off small and they get bigger. The income tax was introduced during the Napoleonic Wars as a very tiny temporary tax to pay for the war. Yeah, and I'm paying a lot of it, and if you aren't now, you will soon. So the biggest legacy of 2008 in some ways could be the FTT, the Financial Transactions Tax, if it goes ahead. So that's an example of smart thinking around critical juncture, on advocacy and on programs. Sorry.
Okay.
The answers are too long.
No, they're not. They're great stories. So, we can take another round and then we'll head down for some drinks, I think. So, yeah, Rihanna.
I'd like to just continue on the theme of these feedback loops and adaptation, along with the themes of humility in our work. You mentioned in your presentation with some kind of admiration the venture capitalist firms that do a lot of experimentation and innovation, and they have this kind of fail forward attitude. But I think that the incentives that we face are really different. We're not looking to take a risk for a big reward and make a profit. We're dealing with the money of donors and of taxpayers often. So there's very, very strong incentives against being open about any kind of failure. And so I don't know if you could maybe just share your thoughts about, there has been, I think, a nascent maybe movement of trying to do these failure reports with engineers without borders, or trying to be more, there's the sort of the problem-driven adaptation approach, which I think is like maybe come to be accepted in environments that are fragile or conflict affected, because there's an exception, things can change quickly, so you need to adapt. But otherwise, I think there's not very much acceptance yet for that kind of adaptation in our programming, because we're still tied to log frames and we're still tied to meeting our milestones, etc. So maybe you could just talk about, share your thoughts around adaptation and failure.
There was somebody just here in the middle. Yes, over here. Excuse me.
My name is Abdi. I'm from Somalia. I also in aid industry. I work with UNICEF, so I know what this is about. But you mentioned that, for example, in Somalia, New Deal Compact was a framework. Actually has failed completely in the sense of reality. But if you see, as you said, in reporting-wise, the headquarters, if we see the powers and read, it says that New Deal was successful and worked well. So how we can discourage that organizations are not sincere about the reporting in terms because of they are failing, but when you see them powers, they completely say that things have worked well, and those people who are sitting in headquarters still believe that the idea has worked, but practically has failed. So that's one of the main challenges in aid industry across all organizations. I'm not talking specifically.
So just to be clear, you're saying that the organisations on the ground are reporting myths?
But they're reporting to the donors, the people they are receiving.
The stuff they're reporting is wrong?
They're reporting like things are not true, but they're reporting.
Really interesting. This one here.
Thank you for your presentation. The question I had was just, I'd be interested in your views on the legacy that development assistance has created over the last years and the way it's been obviously delivered is, as we said up front, this pretty linear process. And at the same time, what are your thoughts on the kind of culture that it's spread amongst the recipients of development assistance?
Oh gosh.
And their ability to basically break what I would maybe fairly dramatically say is the shackles of a system. Because it's all well and good for us to be thinking this way and working in that system, but that the recipients have been very much, I would think, conditioned to believing that the system only operates in this way.
So that's a good. I think I'm going to take one more because I think Danny had a question. Well, I think we might make that the last, and then you can come back. But there's some really interesting lines opening up about the gaps between rhetoric and myths and realities on the ground, and then the power relations about how people on the ground imbibe the myths. And how do we break that power cycle? But Danny, I'd be like to want to ask something else.
Hi, Duncan, and I think it's a great, very clear presentation. I think you'll know that I probably agree with a lot of your analysis around how change happens. My question is really about whether you're applying that analysis to your comments on the SDGs and other sorts of processes. Because in one sentence you say states aren't monolithic, there's complex power relationships, different people are doing different things. But then when you apply it to the SDGs, you've got a very cynical, quite, I think, monolithic view of the different actors that are playing into that process. And I also feel that I agree with your analysis about the sort of the SDGs in terms of their number crunching, the way they're setting up their targets, the likely outcomes of those particular sorts of processes. But I also think actually if you take your analysis and look at it systemically, you'll probably find that the biggest impacts are not those linear impact changes. So for example, I can already see a huge change in the discourse around disability because of the numbers of groups that mobilised into that space and took their thinking horizontally into all sorts of other spaces. It's changing donor thinking, it's changing NGO thinking, it's changing all sorts of other thinking, just because that space existed and people mobilised around it. I don't think that had anything to do with whether the SDGs are going to have an impact. Right? Okay. And I think the same thing is true of things like the lead now and behind discourse, because it's changing the way people are talking about development. So instead of thinking about this MDG focus on the 10, 15% to the 30, 40% where we're going to use growth to improve their income and so on, it's saying we're going to focus on the poorest and most marginalised. Again, whether the SDG infrastructure helps to create that change, I have no idea, and maybe in some places it will or it won't. But I do think it's changed the discourse, which comes back to your norms thing. And for that reason, I think it was really worth the effort that was put into it. So my sort of observation is that if you apply your own thinking about how change happens, you might not have quite such a black and white view of the SDG process.
Great. Culture, power, discourse, and
just as well I'm comfortable with ambiguity and confusion, isn't it? Okay, great questions. So yeah, the difference between aid agencies and venture capitalists is no one's going to become a billionaire because we get it right. So that is and we will be punished if we have 90% failure rates. So what can we do about that? Well, I mean, I don't think Engineers Without Borders did this, failing, give us your best failure website, and amazingly, very few people submitted stories. And we did it inside Oxfam. So we said we had one, the advocacy team went off on one of their endless away days and said, everybody bring your failure story. And my team, the research team, went first. And we did it, because we're naive, we said, yeah, we screwed up on this, look at this. And we went, oh. And then everybody else's was, well, my failure is I just worked too hard. So I don't think calling it failure works. I think saying, what have you learned, is the same, covering the same ground in a much more positive way. I think that might have more possibilities, but failing is just not a word that people like. When I was at DFID, there was a team called the Poor Performers team, and they couldn't work out why they couldn't recruit. It was great, and now it's fragile states world, But, so, an example of what you can do about, rather than sort of celebrate failure, and yes, you can talk about learning, but also, with the example in Tanzania, a bit more detail in Tanzania, we did this multiple parallel experiment on accountability. The money came through KPMG. We set up 8 experiments on accountability and said after 9 months we're going to sit down with the partners and the communities and decide which ones are good and scale those up and shut down the ones which are not so good. And at one point KPMG said, we don't like your theory of change. So, right. So I went over and some other people went over and we spent a week with a team out doing this stuff on the ground in Chinyanga. And then we had a kind of theory of change wonk-off with the guy from KPMG. And the real clincher was when we said, actually, this is a venture capitalist model of change here, private sector. And they gave us another $1 million because we used the right language. So I think, framing and language matters. And so surely if it works for venture capitalists, we ought to be able to sell it to some enlightened donors at least. Then the sort of question went sort of segued into whether we're capable of adaptive management, whether the donors are capable of doing this adaptive management outside extreme situations. So yes, in a sense, the shift towards fragile and conflict states, the fact that that's where most poor people are going to be in 20 years' time, and that's where nothing we've tried has worked very well over the last 30 years, is definitely focusing minds and getting people thinking about trying new things. So in that sense, the shift towards fragile states is helping. But again, I would say that a lot of really interesting stuff is already happening in the donors on this. The whole adaptive management conversation. DFID and the USAID are funding something called the Global Learning on Adaptive Management Scheme, which spells GLAM. So I circulated a photo of David Bowie around, and apparently no one had pointed this out to them. So if you want to be glam, you can, you know, they're still open for funding bids. So there, a lot of interesting stuff, this practical adaptation network, a lot of interesting stuff is coming from the donors. The donors get this. And what they're actually trying to do is influence the rest of the aid business, the big management consultants, the big implementers, to start thinking in these terms. So I think there's lots to work with there. Really interesting question from Somalia about, like, if you create these systems of reporting, people will make up the numbers. Right? So Matt Andrews, who's written wonderful stuff on institutional reform, calls it isomorphic mimicry. It's like species imitate other species so that they're left alone. Yeah, like those things which are not wasps, which look like wasps, that kind of thing. So people will make up the numbers, people will create anti-corruption commissions just to keep those happy, but they won't do anything. So this is all part of the failure of this top-down kind of linear thinking. Much more interesting to see what's bubbling up in Somalia or elsewhere. And that means decentralisation of power within the aid industry. Yeah, and that's a big ask. It's happening slowly in the NGOs. I don't know what's going on in UNICEF, but it'll be slow, whatever it is, I'm sure. We're getting there. Just a couple more. The carpe per diem culture, someone called it. Right? So this is, when you go to East Africa, you have to pay people to come to seminars. And in a way it's fair, because we get paid to go to them, so why shouldn't the communities get paid to come to them? But actually, civil servants, it's a major part of their income now. So they have to do like 10 days seminars a month to double their wages. And you've created this awful system which is just completely dysfunctional. I was launching the last book in Kenya and people were passing out messages asking for bribes to review the book while I was launching the book. So yes, we've created some horrible things, and I don't. Yeah, in some senses, the sooner we get out, the better. I think we could have a slightly more robust way of exiting. So one of the things I'm really exercised about is that we have done almost nothing to enable domestic civil society organisations to raise money locally. We've kept them dependent on us because that's our job. Right? There's enormous amounts of altruistic giving goes on in many developing countries. Zakat, the Ramadan-based Muslim tithe, people estimate it's $1 trillion a year. No one knows where it's going. A lot of it's wasted, but there's a lot of altruistic giving which could be tapped in by local CSOs. That's just one example. Altruistic giving in other faith organisations, but also just a tradition of reciprocity. You know, there's lots of stuff there, and yet we've taught them to write these weird funding applications and to depend on us. And now they're being accused of being foreign stooges. Surprise, surprise. So we've created the vulnerability and done nothing to help them get off it. There's no fundraisers without borders, right? There is clowns without borders. There is lawyers without borders. Why isn't there a fundraisers without borders who can go and help organisations to do this stuff? And finally, Danny, yes, you're right. You know, there may be unintended benefits to an enormous global conversation. Well, what an incredibly expensive and annoying way to achieve the unintended benefits. It may be the disability movement, which was massive before the SDGs, could never have got where it's got today without spending an enormous amount of time in Christmas tree conversations around the SDGs. I think it could have got there anyway, but I'll take that. You know, I'm comfortable that there will be some nice, it's not a monolith. The SDGs have to do some good somewhere. I'm comfortable with that conclusion. I don't think it changes the fact that they were really terribly designed. I think that's it.
Fantastic. Well, I think there may be further issues to follow up, including the SDG conversation. But let's go down now, those who are able to stay, and continue over a drink. Please join me in thanking Duncan enormously.